In the third millennium before the Common Era, when the great empires of antiquity had yet to cast their shadows across continents, the Mesopotamian plain witnessed the crystallization of a phenomenon that would define human civilization for the next 5,000 years: organized, sustained warfare over territorial sovereignty. The conflict between Lagash and Umma, two Sumerian city-states locked in a generational struggle over a narrow strip of agricultural land called the Gu'edena, represents not merely an ancient quarrel between neighboring polities, but rather the first documented expression of what we now recognize as strategic thinking, the calculated application of organized violence in pursuit of defined political objectives. The year is approximately 2450 BCE, though the chronology of early dynastic Mesopotamia remains subject to scholarly refinement. The alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers has become a tapestry of independent city-states, each dominated by monumental temple complexes and governed by rulers who claim divine mandate. These are not tribal chieftains commanding loose confederations of warriors. These are administrators of complex bureaucratic states, capable of mobilizing thousands of men, provisioning them for extended campaigns, and coordinating their movements across operational theaters that span dozens of kilometers. The sophistication required for such undertakings cannot be overstated. This is warfare as an extension of state policy, conducted with a level of organizational capacity that would not seem alien to a modern general staff. Lagash, positioned in the southeastern quadrant of Sumer, controls a network of irrigation canals that draw from the Tigris, transforming the otherwise arid landscape into fields of barley, emmer, wheat, and date palm orchards. Its wealth derives not from conquest, but from hydraulic engineering, the patient, multi-generational effort to master the capricious flooding patterns of Mesopotamian rivers. The city's ziggurat rises above the plain like a geometric mountain, its mud brick facade gleaming white under the merciless sun, a monument to surplus agricultural production and the hierarchical society such surplus enables. The ruler of Lagash during the critical phase of this conflict is Eannatum, a figure whose name appears in the earliest historical records not as myth but as documented facta, commander whose military campaigns were commemorated in stone, whose tactical decisions were recorded for posterity, whose victory monument would become one of the most significant artifacts of Bronze Age warfare, positioned to the northwest along the same network of waterways, presents a mirror image of Lagash's development, another hydraulic civilization, another temple-dominated urban center, another population dependent upon the precise management of water resources in an environment where rainfall alone cannot sustain intensive agriculture. The tension between these two states emerges from a geographical reality that admits no compromise. Both cities require access to the same water sources, and both have expanded their agricultural hinterlands until they meet at the Gu'edena, a stretch of particularly fertile soil that represents perhaps 20 square kilometers of contested territory. In a world where agricultural surplus determines military capacity, where the ability to provision an army for even a few weeks of campaigning requires careful accumulation of grain stores. This disputed borderland is not a peripheral concern, but an existential question. The strategic calculus of early dynastic Sumer operates according to principles that would be recognizable to any student of military affairs. The city-state as a political entity possesses limited manpower populations in the range of 30 to 50,000 inhabitants, of whom perhaps 10 to 15% can be mobilized for military service without catastrophic disruption to agricultural production. These are not professional standing armies but militia forces, drawn from the farmer-artisan class that constitutes the free citizenry, supplemented by smaller contingents of elite troops who serve in the immediate retinue of the ruler. The logistics of mobilization require months of preparation, the accumulation of barley rations, the manufacture of weapons and equipment, the organization of supply trains that will accompany the army into the field. Once mobilized, such a force represents an enormous expenditure of state resources. a temporary redirection of labor from productive agriculture to destructive warfare, sustainable only for a limited campaign. Seasoned before the imperatives of harvest compelled demobilization, the disputed Gu'edena sits astride the boundary between the two city-states, its possession conferring not only immediate agricultural benefit but also strategic depth control of the field allows the dominant power to extend its irrigation network, to establish fortified positions that can serve as staging areas for further operations, to deny the adversary the resources that might fund resistance. This is not a war of annihilation or conquest. Neither Lagash nor Umma possesses the capacity to occupy and permanently garrison the other's urban core. Rather, this is a conflict over the terms of coexistence, over the precise delineation of spheres of influence, over the question of which city-state will dictate the political arrangements of the region. In modern terminology, we would classify this as a limited war conducted for limited objectives, but the limitation is imposed by capability, rather than restraint, by the logistical and demographic constraints of Bronze Age warfare rather than any ethical prohibition against total war. The generation preceding Eannatum's reign witnessed multiple campaigns over the Gu'edena, a pattern of seasonal warfare in which armies would mobilize, march to the disputed territory, engage in set-piece battle, and then withdraw regardless of outcome. Neither side proved capable of delivering a decisive blow, of inflicting casualties sufficient to break the adversary's will to resist, of seizing terrain in such a manner that its retention could be guaranteed through the subsequent agricultural cycle. This pattern of indecisive warfare is itself significant. It suggests a rough parity of military capability, a balance of power in which neither antagonist can achieve their objectives. Neither can afford to abandon the contest. But neither can afford to abandon the contest. The result is a grinding, attritional struggle that consumes resources, disrupts agricultural production, and imposes enormous costs on both populations without resolving the underlying territorial dispute. Eannatum ascends to power in Lagash with an explicit mandate to break this strategic stalemate. The textual evidence, fragmentary though it is, suggests a ruler who understands that the existing pattern of warfare has reached a point of diminishing returns, that something must change if Lagash is to secure its claims to the Gu'edena. The solution he pursues is not diplomatic. There is no evidence of negotiated settlement or territorial compromise, but rather military, the assembly of a force, sufficiently large and sufficiently well-equipped to achieve tactical supremacy on the battlefield, to inflict upon Umma a defeat so comprehensive that continued resistance becomes untenable. This requires not merely incremental improvement in military capacity, but a qualitative leap in organization, equipment, and tactical doctrine. The strategic environment of 3rd millennium Mesopotamia allows for such concentrated military effort precisely because warfare, while endemic, is not yet industrialized. The city-states of Sumer conduct their conflicts according to unwritten but generally observed conventions. Campaigns occur during specific seasons when agricultural demands permit mobilization. Battles take place in open terrain where both sides can deploy their forces, and the objectives of warfare remain limited to territorial adjustment rather than the complete destruction of the adversary. Within this framework, a state that can temporarily achieve marked superiority in a single decisive engagement can translate that tactical victory into strategic concessions, can impose a settlement that reflects the battlefield outcome. Eannatum's design of conflict thus centers on the creation of conditions for such a decisive engagement, the marshaling of resources, the refinement of tactics, the selection of favorable terrain, the timing of mobilization to catch the adversary at a moment of relative weakness. The geopolitical canvas against which this conflict unfolds is one of perpetual low-intensity competition among dozens of independent city-states, none possessing hegemonic authority, none capable of imposing a regional order through force alone. Lagash and Umma are significant polities within this system, but they are not the largest or most powerful. To their north lies Kish, a city that claims a ceremonial primacy over Sumer. To their south, Ur and Uruk represent centers of comparable wealth and military capacity. The balance of power is fluid. with alliances forming and dissolving according to immediate strategic circumstances, with no permanent blocs or stable coalitions. In this environment, a localized conflict between two adjacent states can escalate or de-escalate rapidly depending on whether external powers choose to intervene, whether the contest attracts opportunistic predation from neighbors seeking to exploit the distraction of both combatants. The evidence suggests that Eannatum conducts diplomacy in parallel with military preparation, securing at minimum the neutrality of neighboring states, ensuring that Lagash's mobilization for war against Umma does not invite intervention by third parties. This is statecraft in its most essential form, the creation of favorable external conditions that allow the concentration of force against a single adversary. The details of these diplomatic arrangements are lost to us, preserved, if at all, in archives that have long since returned to the clay from which they came, but the strategic logic is clear. A city-state that mobilizes for war renders itself temporarily vulnerable to external attack. The bulk of its military-age male population is concentrated in the army, leaving the city itself defended by minimal garrisons. Only a state confident in its external security can afford to commit to decisive battle, can risk the concentration of force required for tactical supremacy. The impossible stakes of this conflict derive from its fundamentally zero-sum character. The Gu'edena cannot be equitably divided. The irrigation infrastructure required to exploit the land demands unified control. Coordinated management, the ability to direct water flows without interference from a hostile neighbor. Either Lagash or Umma will dominate this territory, will reap its agricultural surplus, will extend its strategic frontier to a defensible line, but not both. The language of the period, preserved in royal inscriptions and administrative documents, frames this contest in absolute terms. The ruler of Lagash fights not for advantage but for divine favor, not for territory but for cosmic order. The gods have decreed boundaries. The enemy has transgressed those boundaries. Warfare becomes an act of restoration, a return to proper arrangement. This ideological framing should not obscure the material stakes control of agricultural land, access to water resources, the strategic depth required to defend against external threats, but neither should we dismiss it as mere propaganda. In a society where religious and political authority are inseparable, where the legitimacy of the state derives from temple hierarchies, this framing is itself a strategic asset, a means of mobilizing popular support for costly military campaigns. Eannatum's strategic design thus operates on multiple levels simultaneously: the material preparation of military forces, the diplomatic isolation of the adversary, the ideological justification of warfare, and the tactical planning required to translate battlefield victory into political settlement. This is not the simple aggression of a warlord seeking plunder, but rather the calculated strategy of a state seeking to resolve a long-standing territorial dispute in its favor. The conflict that follows will be remembered not because it is unique. Border wars are endemic in early dynastic Sumer, but because it is documented with unprecedented detail, because the victor chooses to commemorate his achievement in a monument that will survive for 4.5 millennia, because the Stele of the Vultures captures in limestone relief the tactical realities of Bronze Age warfare with a precision that allows modern scholars to reconstruct the engagement with reasonable confidence. The design of this conflict reflects the constraints and opportunities of its era. Limited objectives pursued with limited means, but pursued with a level of sophistication that marks the emergence of warfare as a distinct field of human endeavor, subject to rational analysis and systematic improvement. The armies that will clash in the Gu'edena are not mobs but organized formations, not impromptu gatherings but carefully structured units with defined roles and tactical doctrines. The commanders are not merely brave warriors but planners, logisticians, men who understand that victory emerges from preparation as much as from valor, that the battlefield is a problem to be solved through the application of intelligence and resources. This is the threshold moment when warfare becomes an art, when military affairs become worthy of serious study, when the first military historians, the scribes who recorded Eannatum's campaigns, begin the tradition of analyzing conflict that continues to this day. The reconstruction of early dynastic Sumerian military organization requires the synthesis of fragmentary textual evidence iconographic. Representations from victory monuments and cylinder seals, archaeological finds of weapons and armor, and comparative analysis with later Mesopotamian military systems whose documentation is more complete. The result is necessarily speculative in its details, but robust in its general outlines. We can speak with confidence about the broad structure of Lagash's army, about the types of units deployed and the tactical roles they filled, even as specific questions about unit size, command structure, and operational procedures remain subject to debate. The fundamental building block of Sumerian military forces is the phalanx, a dense formation of heavy infantry armed with spears and protected by large rectangular shields. The term phalanx is borrowed from classical Greek warfare, but the tactical concept it describes appears independently in Mesopotamia more than 2 millennia earlier. The Stele of the Vultures depicts these formations with remarkable clarity, ranks of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to present a continuous defensive front, their spears projecting forward to create a hedge of bronze points that any attacker must penetrate. This is not the loose, individualistic combat of Homeric heroes. This is coordinated, disciplined unit action in which the effectiveness of the formation depends upon maintaining cohesion, in which individual prowess matters less than collective discipline. Each soldier in the phalanx bears equipment that represents a substantial investment of resources. The shield is constructed from woven reeds or wooden planks, covered with leather, and reinforced with bronze bosses, a defensive implement large enough to protect the torso from neck to thigh, heavy enough that prolonged combat imposes significant physical fatigue. The spear is perhaps 2 meters in length, its shaft made from imported timber, its point cast from arsenical bronze. The alloy technology that defines the Bronze Age. Many soldiers wear helmets, simple bronze caps that protect against glancing blows but offer no protection to the face or neck. Some wear heavy cloaks or leather corselets, adding further protection at the cost of mobility and endurance. The overall impression is of an infantry force optimized for set-piece battle in open terrain, designed to engage similar formations in frontal combat, trading casualties in a grinding test of discipline and staying power. The tactical employment of the phalanx follows principles that would remain valid for the next 3,000 years of infantry warfare. The formation advances slowly, maintaining alignment, preserving the integrity of the shield wall. The objective is to close with the enemy formation, to bring the 2 lines of spears into contact, and then to push, literally, physically push, attempting to break the cohesion of the opposing formation, to create gaps through which individuals can be isolated and killed. This is warfare as collective athletic contest, demanding not speed or agility but strength, endurance, and the moral courage to stand in place while bronze points seek gaps in one's defense. The casualties in such combat are often surprisingly modest by the standards of later warfare. The shield wall is effective protection, and the spear is not an especially lethal weapon when employed against a similarly equipped adversary, but the psychological pressure is immense. The side that breaks first, that loses cohesion and begins to fall back, exposes itself to massacre as organized withdrawal becomes disordered flight. The size of these phalanx formations remains uncertain. The iconographic evidence suggests units numbering in the dozens rather than hundreds. Blocks of 30 to 50 men appear to be the standard tactical element. Multiple such blocks could be deployed side by side to create a battle line appropriate to the width of the engagement area, or arranged in depth to provide reserves that can reinforce the front line or exploit a breakthrough. The total strength of Eannatum's army at the decisive battle likely numbers between 2,000 and 4,000 men, a force that represents the maximum mobilization capacity of a city-state, the size of Lagash, drawing upon the entire population of free citizens capable of bearing arms. This is not a professional army but a militia force, men who spend most of their lives as farmers, and artisans but who have been trained in the basic skills of formation combat, who can be mobilized for seasonal campaigns and then returned to productive labor. In addition to the heavy infantry phalanx, Sumerian armies employ lighter troops whose tactical role is to harass the enemy formation, to screen the advance of their own phalanx, and to pursue broken enemy forces. These light infantry are equipped with bows, slings, or throwing spears, ranged weapons that allow them to inflict casualties without closing to hand-to-hand combat. They wear minimal armor, relying on mobility rather than protection for survival. Their effectiveness against a well-formed phalanx is limited. The shield wall provides good protection against archery, and light troops lack the mass and cohesion to engage heavy infantry in melee, but they serve important auxiliary functions. They can occupy terrain that would be difficult for the phalanx to traverse. They can threaten supply lines and foraging parties, and they can turn a tactical victory into strategic success by running down fleeing enemies and preventing their reorganization. The most prestigious and tactically significant component of the Sumerian order of battle is the chariot. Though the vehicles of this period bear little resemblance to the light, two-wheeled chariots that would dominate Bronze Age warfare a millennium later. Early dynastic chariots are heavy, four-wheeled vehicles drawn by teams of 4 onagers wild asses that have been domesticated for draft purposes but lack the speed and stamina of the horses that will later revolutionize mobile warfare. Each chariot carries a crew of 2, a driver who controls the team and a warrior armed with javelins or a short spear. The vehicle itself is constructed from wood and leather, reinforced with bronze fittings, and represents a major capital investment. The timber must be imported from forested regions hundreds of kilometers distant. The bronze fittings require significant quantities of copper and tin, and the onagers must be captured, trained, and maintained at considerable expense. The tactical employment of these chariots is necessarily constrained by their limited mobility. They cannot maneuver rapidly, cannot execute the flanking movements or breakthrough charges that will characterize chariot warfare in later periods. Instead, they serve primarily as mobile command platforms, allowing senior officers to position themselves where they can observe the battlefield and direct the movement of their units, and as psychological weapons whose presence on the field may intimidate less experienced adversaries. Some evidence suggests they are also employed as personnel carriers, transporting elite troops to critical points in the battle line, though the limited carrying capacity of each vehicle restricts this role. The archaeological record indicates that chariots occasionally engage directly in combat, possibly charging into the flank of enemy formations that have already been engaged to their front. But this appears to be a specialized tactic rather than their primary function. The command structure of Eannatum's army reflects the hierarchical nature of Sumerian society. At the apex stands the ruler himself, who exercises direct operational command during major campaigns. This is not symbolic leadership from a safe distance, but personal presence at the point of decision. The iconography depicts Eannatum at the head of his phalanx, participating directly in the combat. Below the ruler are senior officers, likely drawn from the elite families that control Lagash's temple hierarchies and administrative apparatus, men who command individual phalanx blocks or groups of such blocks. The middle tier of command consists of unit leaders, experienced soldiers who maintain discipline within their formations and execute the tactical directions of their superiors. At the lowest level are the individual soldiers, whose primary responsibility is to maintain position within the formation and to follow orders without question. This command structure allows for a degree of tactical flexibility. The army can maneuver in multiple columns, can divide to occupy separate positions, can concentrate rapidly when contact with the enemy is imminent, but it also imposes significant limitations. Communication on the Bronze Age battlefield is restricted to voice commands, signal flags, or trumpet calls, all of which are difficult to employ once combat is joined and the noise and confusion of battle overwhelm attempts at coordination. The successful commander is therefore one who positions his forces correctly before battle is joined, who ensures that his subordinates understand their roles, and who maintains a reserve that can be committed at the critical moment without requiring complex communication. The emphasis in Sumerian military training appears to be on drilling formations in basic maneuvers, advancing, inline wheeling to change facing, forming up from column into line of battle, rather than on complex tactical schemes that require precise timing and coordination. The logistics of sustaining this army in the field represent a triumph of administrative capacity. Each soldier requires approximately 1 kilogram of barley per day, supplemented by smaller quantities of oil, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish. An army of 3,000 men thus consumes 3 tons of grain daily, plus fodder for the draft animals that accompany the baggage train. For a campaign lasting 30 days, roughly the maximum duration that can be sustained without catastrophic disruption to agricultural production, the total requirement exceeds 90 tons of barley, plus comparable quantities of other supplies. This must be accumulated in advance, stored in granaries, and then transported to the theater of operations by donkey or oxen-drawn cart, each of which requires its own fodder and water. The administrative apparatus required to coordinate this effort is substantial. Scribes to track inventory, officials to requisition supplies from the temple granaries and private households, laborers to load and unload the supply trains, guards to protect the logistics network from enemy raiders. Water supply presents an even more critical constraint. Each soldier requires several liters of water per day, a requirement that increases dramatically under the desert sun of a Mesopotamian summer. The army cannot operate far from reliable water sources, rivers, canals, or wells, and the route of advance must be planned to ensure access to water at regular intervals. This logistical reality shapes the operational geography of the campaign. Certain routes of advance become infeasible regardless of their tactical advantages, and control of water sources becomes a strategic objective in its own right. The army that can deny the enemy access to water while maintaining its own supply enjoys a decisive advantage, one that may compel the adversary to give battle under unfavorable conditions or to withdraw entirely. The weapons technology of early dynastic Sumer represents the cutting edge of Bronze Age metallurgy. The spear points are cast in 2-piece molds, producing a socketed blade that can be hafted to a wooden shaft with both binding and rivets for maximum strength. The bronze contains approximately 10% tin, an alloy ratio that provides good hardness and edge retention without excessive brittleness. The manufacturing process is labor-intensive. The copper must be smelted from ore, the tin imported from distant sources in Anatolia or the Iranian plateau, the two metals alloyed in precise proportions, and the final product cast, finished, and sharpened. A single spear point might represent several days of skilled labor plus the value of the raw materials, making it a significant investment of resources. Multiply this by the thousands of spear points required to equip an army, and the economic cost of mobilization becomes apparent. Defensive technology shows similar sophistication. The shields are engineered to balance protection against weight. Shield that is too heavy cannot be carried for extended periods, while one that is too light will not stop a spear thrust. The solution involves layered construction, a frame of wooden planks or woven reeds covered with thick leather, reinforced at critical points with bronze plates or bosses. The resulting implement provides good protection against the bronze weapons of the period while remaining light enough for a trained soldier to carry throughout a day's march and subsequent battle. The helmets are simple bronze caps, hammered from a single sheet of metal, offering protection against glancing blows to the skull while leaving the face exposed. More elaborate armor exists for elite troops' bronze scale corselets, leather greaves, but the bulk of the army makes do with simpler protection. The tactical doctrine that governs the employment of these forces emphasizes shock and cohesion. The phalanx is designed to deliver maximum impact at the moment of contact with the enemy, to overwhelm the opposing formation through the concentration of force at the point of decision. This requires careful positioning before battle. The army must deploy on relatively flat, open terrain where the phalanx can maintain formation, must align its front to maximize the number of spears that can engage the enemy simultaneously, must ensure that its flanks are secured by terrain features or by detached units that can prevent enemy envelopment. Once battle is joined, tactical control becomes minimal. The fight devolves into a grinding push of phalanx against phalanx, with victory going to the side that maintains cohesion longer, that can continue pushing while the enemy formation begins to buckle and break. The training required to create effective phalanx soldiers is substantial but not prohibitive. The citizen militia of Lagash likely undergoes periodic training exercises, perhaps monthly or seasonal gatherings where the free male population drills in formation tactics under the supervision of experienced soldiers. This is sufficient to instill the basic skills: how to maintain alignment, how to hold a spear and shield, how to advance without breaking formation, but it cannot replicate the stress of actual combat. The difference between a formation that has drilled together and one that has fought together is significant. Veteran units possess a cohesion and mutual confidence that cannot be taught but must be earned through shared experience of battle. Eannatum's army includes a core of veterans from previous campaigns against, men who have stood in the shield wall before and know what to expect, and this veteran cadre provides the steadying influence that prevents panic when the formations collide. The order of battle that Eannatum assembles for the decisive campaign against Umma thus represents the maximum military capacity of an early dynastic Sumerian city-state. Several thousand heavy infantrymen organized into phalanx formations. Several hundred light infantry providing screening and skirmishing capability, a small number of chariots serving as mobile command posts and prestige symbols, and a logistics apparatus capable of sustaining these forces in the field for several weeks of active campaigning. This is not a revolutionary force, not an army that introduces new technologies or tactics that will transform warfare. Rather, it is the culmination of existing Sumerian military practice, the perfected expression of a tactical system that has evolved over multiple generations of conflict. The innovation lies not in the components of the army, but in their scale and coordination. In Eannatum's ability to mobilize and provision a force larger than any Lagash has previously fielded to maintain its cohesion through the march to the theater of operations and to employ it with sufficient skill to achieve decisive tactical superiority over Umma's comparable forces. The reconstruction of the actual campaign between Lagash and Umma requires careful synthesis of multiple fragmentary sources. The primary evidence comes from the Stele of the Vultures itself, a limestone monument approximately 1.8 meters tall, carved in relief on both sides with scenes of battle and accompanying cuneiform inscriptions that narrate Eannatum's victory. Secondary evidence includes administrative tablets from Lagash that record the distribution of rations to military units, votive inscriptions that commemorate the campaign, and comparative analysis with later Mesopotamian military operations whose documentation is more complete. From these sources emerges a narrative of the campaign that, while incomplete in its details, provides sufficient information to reconstruct the sequence of operations and to analyze the tactical decisions that determined the outcome. The strategic context for Eannatum's campaign is a resumption of the long-standing territorial dispute over the Gu'edena following a period of uneasy peace. The immediate trigger appears to be Umma's attempt to extend its irrigation network into territory that Lagash considers part of its sphere of control, an action that Eannatum interprets as territorial aggression requiring military response. The inscriptions frame this in religious terms. Umma has violated boundaries established by the gods, has transgressed divine decree and must be punished, but beneath the theological language lies a strategic calculation. If Lagash allows this encroachment to stand unchallenged, it effectively concedes the contested territory and invites further Ummate expansion. Conversely, a decisive military response that inflicts substantial casualties on Umma and compels withdrawal from the disputed zone can establish Lagash's dominance over the borderland and deter future encroachment. The mobilization for this campaign represents a major undertaking for Lagash. The agricultural calendar of Mesopotamia divides the year into distinct seasons: the planting season when winter rains soften the soil, the growing season when crops mature, the harvest season when the year's agricultural production is gathered, and the dry season when minimal agricultural labor is required. Military campaigns are typically timed for the period immediately following harvest, when grain stores are at their maximum, when the male population can be spared from agricultural labor, and when the heat of summer has passed but the winter rains have not yet turned roads into impassable mud. Eannatum's campaign likely begins in late autumn, perhaps October or November by modern reckoning, allowing several weeks for operations before the onset of winter weather. The army assembles at Lagash over a period of days or weeks. Soldiers report from the surrounding countryside, drawing their weapons and equipment from temple armories, receiving rations for the march, and forming up into their designated units. The administrative machinery of the state works at maximum capacity. Scribes record the issuance of weapons and rations, ensuring accountability and allowing for the replacement of losses. Officials inspect the irrigation system to ensure that critical maintenance is completed before the departure of the workforce. Priests conduct sacrifices and divination rituals to determine divine favor for the campaign. The psychological preparation is as important as the material. The soldiers must be convinced that their cause is just, that divine powers support their enterprise, that victory is not merely possible but ordained. The religious ceremonies that precede departure serve this function, reinforcing the ideological framework that justifies warfare and sustains morale through the hardships of campaign. The march from Lagash to the Gu'edena covers approximately 30 to 40 kilometers, a distance that requires 2 to 3 days for an army moving at the pace of its slowest elements. The phalanx blocks advance in column formation, each unit maintaining internal cohesion while remaining separated from adjacent units by sufficient distance to prevent congestion. The light infantry ranges ahead into the flanks, screening the main body from surprise attack and providing early warning of enemy contact. The baggage train follows behind, a lengthy column of donkeys and ox carts carrying the grain, water, and equipment required to sustain operations. The rate of advance is constrained by the need to maintain formation, by the limited endurance of soldiers carrying heavy equipment, and by the requirement to camp each night in a defensible position with access to water. The route of advance follows the network of irrigation canals that connects Lagash to the Gu'edena, providing both a reliable water source and relatively flat terrain suitable for the movement of formed units. The canals also serve as navigational aids in a landscape that lacks prominent terrain features. The flat alluvial plain offers few landmarks, and maintaining correct direction of march without such features is challenging. The army likely moves in stages, advancing for several hours in the morning, halting during the heat of midday, and then continuing for a few more hours in the late afternoon before establishing a camp for the night. Each camp must be selected with tactical considerations in mind: proximity to water, defensible perimeter, observation of likely enemy approach routes. The nightly routine of establishing camp, posting sentries, issuing rations, and maintaining weapons represents a substantial organizational challenge, one that requires experienced leadership and disciplined troops. Intelligence regarding Umma's dispositions comes from multiple sources. Scouts sent ahead to reconnoiter the disputed territory, informants from the borderlands who report, make military preparations, and presumably signals intelligence in the form of observed smoke signals or similar communications that reveal enemy movements. The fragmentary evidence suggests that Umma is aware of Lagash's mobilization and has assembled its own army to contest control of the Gu'edena. This is not an ambush or a surprise attack, but a meeting engagement, with both sides advancing toward the disputed territory with the expectation of battle. The strategic advantage lies with the side that can concentrate its forces more rapidly, that can seize favorable terrain before the enemy arrives, that can impose battle on ground of its own choosing. Eannatum's approach to the Gu'edena demonstrates tactical sophistication. Rather than advancing directly toward Umma's position, he maneuvers to occupy a ridgeline or slight elevation that dominates the contested field. The topography of southern Mesopotamia is predominantly flat, but even subtle variations in elevation rises of a few meters above the surrounding plain can confer tactical advantage. The side that occupies high ground forces the enemy to attack uphill, imposing additional fatigue on the attacking force and allowing the defender to employ gravity to add force to spear thrusts and shield pushes. More importantly, elevated ground provides superior observation, allowing commanders to see the enemy formation more clearly and to coordinate their own forces with greater precision. The evidence suggests that Eannatum successfully secures this position before Umma can contest it, compelling the Ummates to either give battle under unfavorable conditions or to withdraw without engaging, thereby conceding control of the territory. The Ummate commander faces a difficult decision. Withdrawal without battle represents a strategic defeat. Lagash will consolidate control over the Gu'edena, will extend its irrigation infrastructure into the disputed zone, and will have demonstrated military superiority without Umma offering meaningful resistance. Yet, attacking uphill against a prepared enemy position promises heavy casualties with uncertain prospects for success. The textual evidence suggests that Umma chooses to give battle, presumably calculating that even an unfavorable engagement offers better prospects than uncontested concession of the territory. This decision may reflect pressure from Umma's own population, which has been mobilized for war and expects their army to fight, or confidence in their own tactical capabilities, or perhaps simply a commander's refusal to accept defeat without testing the enemy in battle. The deployment for battle follows the standard pattern of Sumerian warfare. Eannatum's phalanx formations deploy along the ridgeline, forming a continuous front several ranks deep. The heavy infantry stands in close order, shields overlapping, spears leveled, presenting a wall of bronze to the advancing enemy. The light infantry positions itself on the flanks and in the intervals between phalanx blocks, ready to harass the Umayyad advance with missile fire. The chariots take position behind the main line, where they can serve as rallying points and command posts without being vulnerable to direct engagement. The entire formation is perhaps 200 meters wide, the maximum frontage that can be effectively controlled by the available command structure, and perhaps 50 meters deep, providing reserves that can reinforce the front ranks or exploit a breakthrough. The Umayyad army advances in similar formation. Phalanx blocks moving forward in coordinated echelon, light troops screening the flanks. The distance between the two armies closes slowly. The phalanx cannot advance rapidly without breaking formation, and maintaining cohesion takes precedence over speed. As the range decreases to within bowshot, Lagash's light infantry begins to inflict casualties, arrows arcing into the Umayyad formations. The effect is primarily psychological rather than material, the overlapping. Shields of the phalanx provide good protection against archery, but the constant rain of missiles imposes stress on troops who must maintain formation while absorbing casualties without the ability to respond. The Umayyad light infantry attempts to suppress Lagash's archers, but the advantage of position allows Eannatum's troops to shoot from partial cover while the Umayyads are exposed on the slope. The collision of the two phalanx lines marks the transition from maneuver to melee, from the phase of battle where tactical skill and positioning matter to the phase where discipline and physical endurance determine the outcome. The Stele of the Vultures depicts this moment with remarkable clarity. The front ranks of both formations locked together, spears seeking gaps in the shield wall, soldiers pushing with their shoulders against their shields in an attempt to drive back the enemy line. This is not heroic individual combat, but collective athletic struggle. Dozens of men on each side pushing in coordinated effort, the entire formation moving as a single organism. The noise is overwhelming, the clash of bronze on bronze, the shouting of men exhorting their comrades, the screams of the wounded, the cracking of spear shafts that snap under the strain. The front ranks bear the greatest stress, physically and psychologically. Men in these positions suffer the highest casualties and endure the greatest fear, knowing that they are the barrier preventing enemy spears from reaching the ranks behind them. The tactical dynamics of phalanx combat favor the side with superior cohesion. Individual prowess matters less than collective discipline. The strongest warrior cannot break an enemy shield wall single-handedly, but a formation that maintains pressure while the enemy formation begins to waver can achieve breakthrough. The evidence suggests that Eannatum's forces maintain their formation integrity better than Umma's, whether due to superior training, better morale, or simply the advantage of fighting from elevated ground. The Umayyad line begins to show signs of strain gaps appear between phalanx blocks as units drift apart under the stress of combat. Wounded men fall back through the ranks, creating disruption, and the pushing contest begins to tilt in Lagash's favor. The turning point in the battle comes when Eannatum commits his reserve, holding back a portion of his forces during the initial clash. He waits until the Umayyad formation shows signs of weakening before committing fresh troops to reinforce his front line. This injection of fresh energy at the critical moment tips the balance decisively. The Umayyad soldiers, already fatigued from the uphill advance and the grinding push of melee combat, face renewed pressure from troops who have not yet engaged. The psychological impact is as important as the physical, seeing fresh enemy units entering the fight while their own reserves have already been committed. The Umayyads begin to lose confidence in their ability to sustain the contest. The collapse of the Umayyad formation, when it comes, is sudden and catastrophic. A section of their line breaks, soldiers turning to flee rather than continuing to stand in the shield wall. The break spreads rapidly along the line as adjacent units, seeing their neighbors in flight and realizing their own flanks are now exposed, lose cohesion and begin their own withdrawal. Within minutes, the organized fighting formation dissolves into a mass of individual soldiers seeking safety. This is the moment of maximum danger and maximum opportunity danger for the fleeing Ummates, who are now vulnerable to pursuit and slaughter. Opportunity for Lagash's forces to turn tactical victory into strategic decimation of the enemy army. Eannatum's light infantry and chariots pursue the broken Ummate forces, running down fleeing soldiers and inflicting casualties that far exceed those of the main battle. The phalanx combat has been relatively constrained in its lethality. The shield wall protects most soldiers from serious wounds, and the close quarters nature of the fighting limits the rate at which casualties can be inflicted. But fleeing soldiers, their backs turned to the enemy, their formations dissolved, are easy targets for javelin and arrow. The pursuit likely continues for several kilometers, until darkness or exhaustion halts the chase, by which point the Ummate army has been shattered as a fighting force. The casualty figures recorded in the inscriptions are staggering by the standards of Bronze Age warfare, tens of thousands of enemy dead, a number that likely includes significant exaggeration but nevertheless indicates a massacre of unusual scale. The battlefield after the engagement presents a scene of methodical brutality. This is not merely artistic symbolism, but documentary representation. The bodies of the dead lie where they fell, exposed to scavengers, a warning to any future adversary of the fate that awaits those who contest Lagash's claims. The wounded receive minimal care. Bronze Age medicine offers little effective treatment for combat injuries, and most of those seriously wounded will die of infection or blood loss in the days following the battle. The victorious army camps on the field, consolidating its position and ensuring that Umma's scattered survivors cannot regroup and contest the outcome. The immediate aftermath of the battle sees Eannatum pursuing strategic objectives that will consolidate his tactical victory. His army advances into Ummate territory. Not to occupy the city itself, Lagash lacks the resources for sustained garrison. Operations deepen enemy territory, but to demonstrate military dominance and to compel political concessions. The inscriptions record the destruction of irrigation infrastructure, the burning of fields, and the looting of outlying settlements, economic warfare designed to impose costs on Umma that will make future resistance prohibitively expensive. Ensures that they will require years to recover their economic strength and creates internal pressure within Umma for accommodation with Lagash rather than continued resistance. The peace settlement that follows the battle reflects the military realities established on the field. And likely pays some form of material compensation, grain, livestock, or other goods as indemnity for the war. The boundary between the two city-states is physically marked with stone monuments, a visible assertion of territorial sovereignty that serves both legal and symbolic functions. More importantly, Eannatum establishes a system of ongoing tribute from Umma, ensuring that Lagash benefits economically from its military victory and that Umma remains in a subordinate relationship. This is not permanent conquest or annexation. Both city-states retain their political independence, but it is a clear establishment of hierarchy, with Lagash as the dominant regional power and Umma as a chastened rival compelled to acknowledge that dominance. The consolidation of victory requires months of additional operations. Lagash extends its irrigation network into the now undisputed Gu'edena, begins agricultural exploitation of the territory, and establishes permanent fortifications or observation posts that can provide early warning of any future Ummate aggression. The administrative apparatus of the state works to document the new territorial arrangements, creating cadastral records that define boundaries, assign land parcels to cultivation, and establish the tax obligations of the population. The army demobilizes gradually, with soldiers returning to their farms and workshops, but with a cadre of veterans maintained in readiness for rapid mobilization if required. The entire process represents a triumph of state capacity, the ability not merely to win battles, but to translate battlefield success into enduring political and economic arrangements. To comprehend the Lagash and Umma War beyond its strategic and tactical dimensions requires descending from the map view to the ground level, from the abstract movement of formations to the lived experience of the individual soldiers who stood in the phalanx, who felt the impact of bronze on shield, who smelled the blood and dust of the battlefield. The sources provide only fragmentary glimpses of this human dimension. Ancient military history privileges commanders over common soldiers, records strategic outcomes rather than personal experiences. But careful reading of the evidence, supplemented by comparative analysis with later historical periods where documentation is richer, allows for reasonable reconstruction of what it meant to serve in Eannatum's army, to march to the Gu'edena, and to stand in the shield wall when the Ummate phalanx came into contact. The soldier of early dynastic Lagash is not a professional warrior but a citizen militia member, a man whose primary identity is as farmer or artisan, but who accepts military service as an obligation of citizenship. His training is periodic rather than continuous, perhaps monthly gatherings where the free male population drills in formation tactics, learns to maintain alignment while advancing, practices the coordinated use of spear and shield. This is sufficient to create basic competence in the mechanics of phalanx combat, but it cannot replicate the psychological stress of actual battle, cannot prepare men for the moment when the enemy formation crashes into their own and every instinct, screams to flee while duty demands standing fast. The difference between the trained soldier and the combat veteran is the difference between theoretical knowledge and visceral understanding, between knowing intellectually what battle will be like and having endured it personally. The mobilization for campaign disrupts the rhythm of civilian life. The soldier must leave his fields at a critical moment in the agricultural cycle, entrusting their care to family members or neighbors, knowing that prolonged absence may mean lost harvest and economic hardship. He must gather his equipment: spear, shield, helmet if he possesses one, and report to the assembly point, where he receives his assignment to a specific unit and his ration of barley for the march. The psychological transition from civilian to soldier is marked by these practical arrangements: the donning of military equipment, the subordination of individual will to unit discipline, the acceptance that for the duration of the campaign his life belongs not to himself, but to the state that has mobilized him. For some, this transition may be accompanied by excitement or martial enthusiasm, the prospect of glory and the opportunity to prove valor. For others, it brings anxiety or dread, the awareness that military service may end in death or crippling injury. The march to the theater of operations imposes its own hardships. The phalanx soldier carries perhaps 20 kilograms of equipment: shield, spear, helmet, personal rations, a load that becomes increasingly burdensome over hours of marching under the Mesopotamian sun. The rate of advance is constrained by the need to maintain formation, by the limited endurance of men unused to such sustained physical exertion, and by the requirement to halt periodically for rest and water. The feet suffer blisters form where leather sandals rub against skin, the persistent pain becoming background noise that must be ignored if the soldier is to keep pace with his unit. Thirst is a constant companion. The ration of water, sufficient when the march began, never quite satisfies, and the wait until the next halt at a canal or well feels interminable. The landscape offers little visual interest: flat agricultural fields, broken by irrigation channels, the occasional village of mud brick houses, the temple complex of a minor city visible as a white geometric form on the horizon, and the monotony of the march becomes its own trial. The nights in camp provide only partial respite. The soldiers sleep on the ground, wrapped in cloaks if they possess them, exposed to the chill of desert nights that follows the heat of the day. Sentries rotate throughout the night, maintaining vigilance against surprise attack, their posts marked by small fires that provide minimal warmth and light. The camp itself is an exercise in organized chaos: thousands of men preparing evening meals, maintaining equipment, tending to minor injuries or illness, all within a defined perimeter that must be established and defended. The social dynamics of the unit become more apparent during these hours. The veterans who have campaigned before offer advice and reassurance to the younger soldiers making their first march. The natural leaders who emerge from the ranks to organize their comrades. The shirkers who avoid duty when possible and must be compelled to contribute their share of labor. As the army approaches the Gu'edena and contact with the enemy becomes imminent, the psychological pressure intensifies. Scouts return with reports of unmate forces in the disputed territory, and the abstract prospect of battle becomes concrete reality. The soldiers understand what awaits them. The phalanx collision is not a mystery, but a well-known form of combat, and veterans can describe in detail what the experience will entail. This knowledge does not reduce fear, but gives it specific focus. The fear of standing in the front rank when the enemy spears come within reach. The fear of showing cowardice before one's comrades, the fear of death or crippling injury, the fear of failing in one's duty to city and gods. The night before battle is sleepless for many, hours spent in contemplation of mortality, in prayer to protective deities, in whispered conversations with comrades that serve to reinforce bonds of mutual support. The morning of battle brings a flurry of final preparations. The soldiers check their equipment, testing spear points for sharpness, tightening shield grips, adjusting helmet straps, rituals that provide focus for nervous energy and ensure that no critical failure of equipment will occur at the moment of crisis. The officers move among the ranks, offering encouragement, reminding the soldiers of their training, invoking divine favor for the coming engagement. The army forms up into its battle array, phalanx blocks taking position according to predetermined plan, each soldier finding his assigned place within the formation. The wait for battle to commence is among the most psychologically difficult periods standing in formation. Watching the enemy army deploy in the distance, knowing that within hours the two forces will collide but unable to predict or control the outcome. The advance toward contact occurs in eerie silence, broken only by the rhythmic tramp of thousands of feet, the clink of equipment, and occasional shouted orders. The soldiers maintain formation through constant awareness of their neighbors, adjusting their pace to stay aligned, focusing on the immediate task of keeping step rather than on the larger reality of approaching battle. The distance to the enemy closes with agonizing slowness. The phalanx can advance only as fast as its slowest members, and the final 100 meters may consume 10 or 15 minutes. The psychological pressure builds continuously. Some men begin to show signs of stress, trembling hands, involuntary urination, the blank expression of extreme fear, but the formation continues forward, collective discipline overriding individual panic. The moment of impact between the two phalanx lines is violent and disorienting. The front ranks collide with a crash of wood and bronze, shields slamming together, spears seeking targets. The soldier in the phalanx experiences this collision as overwhelming sensory overload. The deafening noise of thousands of men shouting and weapons clashing, the impact that runs through shield and arm as enemy soldiers push against the formation, the confusion of trying to identify targets through the narrow gap between one's own shield and that of one's neighbor. The training takes overthrust with the spear, maintain shield position, push forward in coordination with comrades' actions that have been drilled until they become automatic, requiring no conscious thought. The conscious mind retreats into a kind of fugue state, aware of immediate sensory input, but unable to process the larger tactical situation, focused entirely on survival through the next few seconds. The physical demands of phalanx combat are extraordinary. The soldier must maintain a half-crouch behind his shield, absorbing the constant pushing from the enemy formation while attempting to add his own strength to his sides, collective effort. The shield arm burns with fatigue, the muscles screaming for rest that cannot be granted while the battle continues. The right arm thrusts the spear repeatedly, seeking any gap in the enemy's shield wall, the motion becoming increasingly clumsy as fatigue sets in. The legs must brace constantly, maintaining balance on ground that may be uneven or slick with blood, preventing the soldier from being pushed backward by the enemy's pressure. The heat is suffocating. The desert sun beats down on men wearing helmets and carrying shields that trap body heat, and the exertion of combat generates tremendous metabolic heat that cannot be adequately dissipated. Some men collapse from heat exhaustion, adding to the confusion and disorder within the formation. The casualties in phalanx combat occur primarily among the front ranks. where the majority of weapons can reach and where the physical pressure is greatest. A soldier in the front rank faces enemy spears within arm's reach, bronze points probing constantly for any gap in his defense. The shield provides good protection if properly maintained, held at the correct angle, overlapping with neighbors' shields, positioned to deflect rather than absorb direct impacts, but a moment's lapse in concentration. A slip on uneven ground, a distraction caused by a wounded comrade, any of these can create an opening that an enemy spear exploits. The wounds inflicted by bronze spear points are devastating. Penetrating wounds to the torso that lacerate internal organs, deep punctures to the limbs that sever major blood vessels. Facial wounds when a spear point passes over or around the shield to strike the unprotected head. Death is often not immediate but arrives after minutes or hours of bleeding. The wounded man falling back through the ranks as his strength fails, eventually collapsing in the rear of the formation where he receives minimal care. The psychological breaking point in phalanx combat is as much collective as individual. The formation holds as long as the soldiers believe their comrades will continue to stand, as long as the social bonds of mutual obligation outweigh the instinct for self-preservation. The process of collapse typically begins subtly. Men in the front rank take small steps backward, creating a slight recession in the line, the formation bending under pressure rather than breaking cleanly. This backward movement accelerates as more soldiers participate, as the collective will to resist erodes under the combination of physical exhaustion, mounting casualties, and psychological stress. Once the backward movement becomes a rout, once soldiers turn their backs to the enemy and begin to run, the careful discipline of formation combat dissolves into individual struggles for survival. This is the moment of maximum danger for the fleeing soldiers and maximum opportunity for the victors, the transition from controlled battle to massacre. For the victorious soldiers of Lagash, the immediate aftermath of battle brings a complex mixture of emotions. The relief of survival is overwhelming, the recognition that one has endured the supreme test of courage and has emerged intact, that the gamble with death has been won. This relief is accompanied by exhaustion so profound that many soldiers simply collapse where they stand. Unable to take another step, their bodies shutting down after the extreme exertion of combat. The pursuit of broken enemy forces offers opportunities for glory and plunder, running down fleeing. Mates stripping valuables from the dead, taking prisoners who may be ransomed, but participation in the pursuit requires a reserve of energy that many do not possess after the main battle. The veterans know that the pursuit is where the decisive casualties are inflicted, that the tactical victory is only complete if the enemy army is shattered beyond capacity to reform, and so they compel their exhausted bodies to continue to chase down the fleeing mates and ensure that the victory is total. The following days bring the grim work of battlefield cleanup and the slow psychological process of returning from the extremity of combat to something approaching normal consciousness. The bodies of the dead must be dealt with. Lagash's fallen are collected for burial, while Umma's dead are left for scavengers, a deliberate act of disrespect that serves both practical and symbolic purposes. The wounded require care that the medical knowledge of the period can barely provide. Wounds are washed, crude bandages applied, but infection is inevitable for any serious injury, and most of the seriously wounded will die within days. The survivors grapple with what they have experienced and what they have done, with the memory of killing enemy soldiers at close range, with the guilt of surviving when comrades did not. Some retreat into themselves, become silent and withdrawn, unable to articulate what they have endured. Others become boisterous, almost manic, celebrating survival with an intensity that seems to deny the reality of mortality they have just confronted. The return march to Lagash after the campaign represents a transition back to civilian life, but the soldiers who make this march are not the same men who departed weeks earlier. They have experienced combat, have stood in the shield wall, have killed, and have seen death at close range. This experience creates a bond with comrades who shared it, a sense of connection stronger than any that exists with those who did not participate. It also creates a psychological burden. The memories of battle do not fade quickly, the nightmares persist. The sudden sounds that trigger involuntary flinching responses, the persistent low-level anxiety that is the legacy of prolonged exposure to mortal danger. The soldier returns to his fields and his family attempts to resume the pattern of civilian life, but Some part of him remains on the battlefield, and the transition back to peace is never as complete as the transition to war was definitive. The celebration of victory in Lagash serves multiple purposes. It honors the soldiers who fought, acknowledges their sacrifice, and reintegrates them into civilian society with enhanced status. It demonstrates to the population that the costs of war, the disruption of agriculture, the casualties, the material expenditure have produced meaningful results in the form of territorial gains and enemy subjugation. It provides religious context for the violence, framing the campaign as divinely ordained and thus morally justified. The monuments erected to commemorate the victory, most notably the Stele of the Vultures, serve as permanent reminders of Lagash's military prowess, as deterrents to future enemies and as historical records that will allow future generations to understand what was achieved. For the individual soldier, these public acknowledgments of service provide some measure of meaning for what was endured, a sense that the suffering and sacrifice were not in vain but contributed to something larger than individual survival. The Stele of the Vultures stands as one of the most important military historical sources from the ancient world, a document carved in limestone that provides unprecedented insight into early dynastic Sumerian warfare. Discovered at Tello, ancient Girsu, a city within the Lagash city-state, in 1881 by French archaeologist Édouard de Sarzec, the Stele originally stood approximately 1.8 meters tall, though it was found in fragments that required careful reconstruction. The monument combines visual representation with cuneiform text, creating a multimedia historical record that captures both the tactical specifics of the battle and the ideological framework, within which Eannatum's victory was understood. As a primary source for military history, the Stele is nearly without parallel for its era. No comparable document exists that depicts early Bronze Age warfare with such detail and precision. The physical form of the Stele reflects its dual function as historical record and religious monument. Carved from a single block of limestone, worked with bronze tools and abrasive sand to create relief images and incised text, the monument represents hundreds of hours of skilled labor. The choice of limestone, a material more durable than the mud brick that constitutes most Sumerian architecture but requiring importation from quarries in the mountains north of the Mesopotamian plain, signals the importance of the monument, the intention that it survive for generations as testimony to Lagash's victory. The Stele was erected in a prominent location within the temple complex at Girsu, where it would be visible to worshippers and visitors, where it would serve as a constant reminder of military achievement and divine favor. The damage the Stele suffered in antiquity, it was found in fragments deliberately broken, may reflect later conflicts in which a conquering enemy sought to symbolically erase Lagash's military glory, though the fact that the fragments were preserved rather than completely destroyed suggests some degree of religious reverence even from adversaries. The visual program of the Stele divides into multiple registers, each depicting a different aspect of the campaign or its aftermath. The obverse face, which bears the most extensive imagery, shows Eannatum leading his army in phalanx formation. The depiction is remarkably detailed. The soldiers are arranged in precise ranks, their shields overlapping in a continuous wall, their spears projecting forward at uniform angle. Eannatum himself stands at the head of the formation, distinguishable from his soldiers by his larger size, a convention of ancient art that indicates superior status rather than literal physical dimensions. He holds a curved weapon that may be a sickle sword, an implement that appears in other Sumerian military contexts and may represent a symbol of command authority. Behind the phalanx, the Stele shows a pile of naked corpses, and above them, vultures and crows carrying away severed heads and limbs. This is the image from which the monument derives its modern name, a depiction of the battlefield after the engagement that is startling in its brutal directness. The tactical information encoded in the phalanx depiction is substantial. The shields are shown as large rectangular implements, each tall enough to protect the soldier from neck to knees, and wide enough that when overlapped with neighbors' shields, they create a continuous defensive surface. The archaeological evidence confirms this representation. Recovered shield remnants show dimensions of approximately 1 meter in height and half a meter in width, constructed from wood or woven reed frames covered with leather and reinforced with bronze. The spears project from the second rank as well as the first, indicating a formation at least 2 ranks deep, possibly more. This detail is significant because it demonstrates tactical sophistication. Formation only 1 rank deep would be vulnerable to breakthrough at any point where a single soldier falls or steps back. While a formation with depth can absorb casualties in the front rank without losing cohesion, can rotate tired soldiers to the rear while fresh troops move forward to replace them. The soldiers in the phalanx wear conical helmets, simple bronze caps that protect the top of the skull without covering the face or neck. Weighing perhaps half a kilogram, offering protection against glancing blows without the weight and visibility restrictions of more extensive armor. Some soldiers also wear what appears to be heavy cloaks or textile armor, possibly felt or multiple layers of linen, offering some protection against cuts and abrasions without the cost and weight of bronze-scale armor. Eannatum's victory over Umma is thus not merely a political achievement, but a religious duty, the enforcement of divine decree against those who transgressed sacred boundaries. The cuneiform inscriptions that accompany the visual imagery provide narrative context and specific details that the pictures alone cannot convey. The text identifies Eannatum by name and title, establishes the theological justification for warfare, and claims specific casualty figures for the battle. The most striking detail is the numerical claim. The inscription states that 3,600 Ummates were killed in the engagement, a number that should be read with appropriate skepticism given the tendency of ancient military records to inflate enemy casualties. However, even if we assume significant exaggeration, perhaps the actual number was half or a third of the claimed figure, this still represents a substantial loss for a Bronze Age city-state army. Casualties in the range of 1 to 2,000 dead, plus comparable numbers wounded, would constitute the destruction of Umma's military capacity for a generation, would remove from the population a significant percentage of military-age males, and would explain why the territorial settlement that followed the battle was so favorable to Lagash. The inscription also preserves details about the boundary settlement that followed the war. It describes the erection of boundary stones marking the extent of Lagash's territorial control, the establishment of a neutral zone between the two city-states, and the imposition of obligations on Umma that suggest some form of tributary relationship. The text frames these arrangements as the restoration of boundaries established by earlier gods and kings, an appeal to precedent that serves to legitimize current territorial claims. This is a recurring pattern in Mesopotamian diplomatic discourse, the assertion that disputed territories actually belong to one's own city-state by ancient right, that the adversary is the aggressor who has violated established boundaries, and that warfare is therefore defensive rather than aggressive. The historical accuracy of these claims is impossible to verify from available sources, but their rhetorical function is clear: to establish moral high ground, and to provide justification for military action that might otherwise appear as naked territorial aggression. The artistic style of the Stele reflects the conventions of early dynastic Sumerian art, figures shown in profile with frontal torsos, uniform sizing except where status distinctions require hierarchical scale narrative progression, indicated through spatial arrangement rather than sequential panels. These conventions may seem primitive to modern viewers accustomed to realistic perspective, but they effectively communicate the essential information: who is fighting, how they are equipped, what the outcome of the battle was. The choice to depict the aftermath of battle with its vultures and corpses rather than the glory of victory ceremony is particularly significant. This is documentary representation rather than propaganda glorification, an unflinching acknowledgement of the violence and death that warfare entails. The modern viewer may find these images disturbing, but they serve as important historical evidence precisely because they do not sanitize warfare, do not present it as abstract strategic maneuvering, but as a human activity with brutal physical consequences. The production of the stele required specialized labor and significant resources. The limestone block had to be quarried in the mountains north of Sumer, transported hundreds of kilometers to Lagash by river barge, and then worked by skilled stone carvers who possessed both the technical ability to execute the relief carving and the literacy required to incise the cuneiform text. The total labor investment might exceed several months of continuous work, representing a substantial expenditure by the state. This investment reflects the importance attached to commemoration, to the creation of a permanent record that would outlast the generation that fought the war, and that would serve as historical evidence for future rulers and as a deterrent to future enemies. The fact that we can study the stele today, 4.5 millennia after its creation, validates the intended permanence of the monument. It has indeed survived to inform later generations about early dynastic warfare, though not in the way its creators might have imagined. The tactical information preserved in the stele allows for reconstruction of Sumerian battle doctrine with reasonable confidence. The phalanx formation depicted is clearly designed for frontal engagement with similarly equipped forces, optimized for pushing contests where mass and cohesion determine victory rather than maneuver or individual combat. The depth of the formation, at least 2 ranks, possibly more, provides tactical flexibility, allowing commanders to rotate tired troops, to reinforce sections of the line under pressure, or to maintain a reserve that can be committed at the critical moment. The presence of light troops implied by the references to pursuit suggests a combined arms approach, with missile troops providing fire support and exploitation capability while the phalanx serves as the main striking force. The chariots shown on other contemporary monuments, if not on this particular stele, complete the order of battle, providing mobile command platforms and elite shock capability. The strategic implications of the stele of the Vultures extend beyond the specific battle it commemorates. The existence of such a monument indicates a society that values military achievement sufficiently to invest substantial resources in its commemoration, that understands the importance of historical record, and that employs sophisticated visual and textual communication to convey complex information about warfare. The level of organizational capacity required to mobilize the army depicted in the stele, thousands of equipped soldiers, coordinated movements sustained. Logistics demonstrates state capacity of a high-order administrative machinery capable of complex tasks that extend far beyond the immediate needs of agricultural management. The ideological framework that combines religious sanction with practical military objectives shows sophisticated political thinking, an understanding that successful warfare requires not only tactical competence, but also moral certainty and social cohesion. The preservation of the stele through millennia of subsequent history is itself remarkable. The monument survived the collapse of early dynastic Sumerian civilization, the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, the chaos of the Gutian period, and the emergence of the Ur III state. At some point, it was deliberately broken, possibly during a later conflict, when an enemy of Lagash sought to, symbolically, erase the city-state's military glory. But the fragments were preserved rather than completely destroyed, suggesting some degree of reverence even from adversaries. The rediscovery of the stele in the late 19th century by French archaeologists represented a milestone in the study of ancient warfare, providing the first detailed visual evidence of Bronze Age battle tactics and confirming the existence of sophisticated military organization in the earliest urban civilizations. The monument now resides in the Louvre Museum, where it continues to serve its commemorative function, though for an audience its creators could never have imagined, not the citizens of Lagash seeking reassurance of their city-state, power, but scholars and general audiences seeking to understand the origins of organized warfare in human civilization. The immediate tactical outcome of the Lagash and Umma war is unambiguous. Eannatum achieves decisive victory on the battlefield, inflicts substantial casualties on Umma's forces, and compels a territorial settlement favorable to Lagash. The disputed Gu'edena comes under Lagash's control. Boundary stones are erected to mark the new frontier, and Umma accepts a subordinate relationship that includes material obligations. From the perspective of 3rd millennium Mesopotamian statecraft, this represents successful prosecution of limited warfare for limited objectives, the employment of military force to resolve a territorial dispute in favor of the victor, the translation of battlefield success into political concessions that advance the interests of the winning state. By the standards of early dynastic Sumer, Eannatum's campaign is an exemplary military operation, efficiently converting accumulated resources into strategic advantage. The human cost of this achievement is substantial. The casualty figures recorded in contemporary sources, even accounting for probable exaggeration, suggest losses in the thousands for Umma and presumably hundreds for Lagash. In societies where the total population of a city-state numbers in the tens of thousands, where the pool of military-age males from which armies are drawn might include only a few thousand individuals, casualties on this scale represent demographic catastrophe. Umma loses a significant percentage of its young male population, disrupting not only military capacity but also agricultural production, craftwork, and the intergenerational transmission of skills and knowledge. The widows and orphans created by the battle become a long-term social burden, requiring support from extended families or temple institutions. The trauma of combat affects not only those who die, but also those who survive the psychological wounds that we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Though unnamed and unacknowledged in ancient sources, nevertheless affect the veterans who return from the Gu'edena. Lagash's victory establishes the city-state as the dominant regional power for a generation. The territorial gains from the war increase agricultural production, providing the economic surplus that funds further military operations and supports the construction of monumental architecture that advertises Lagash's power. The defeat of Umma deters other potential adversaries from challenging Lagash's territorial claims, at least in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. Eannatum uses this period of military supremacy to conduct campaigns against other neighboring city-states, extending Lagash's influence across a wider region. The textual record preserves references to campaigns against Eannatum to the east and against cities to the north, suggesting a systematic program of territorial expansion enabled by the military capacity demonstrated at the Gu'edena. The pattern is familiar from later imperial history. Initial victory over a primary rival creates momentum and opportunity for further expansion, as the demonstration of military effectiveness either deters resistance or attracts allies seeking association with the dominant power. The durability of the territorial settlement, however, proves limited. Within a generation of Eannatum's victory, the inscriptions record renewed conflict between Lagash and Umma over the same disputed territory. The boundary stones erected to mark the post-war frontier are removed or destroyed. Umma's irrigation network again extends into the contested zone, and a new round of warfare becomes necessary to reassert Lagash's claims. This pattern of temporary settlement followed by renewed conflict is characteristic of ancient Near Eastern international relations. The absence of any supra-state authority capable of enforcing agreements means that territorial settlements last only as long as the balance of military power that produced them. Once Umma recovers demographically and economically from the defeat, once Lagash's military supremacy erodes through the natural processes of generational change or defeat in conflicts with other adversaries, the underlying territorial dispute resurfaces and warfare resumes. The strategic limitation of Eannatum's victory reflects the constraints of Bronze Age military capacity. Lagash cannot occupy and permanently garrison Ummate territory. The logistics of maintaining a military presence deep in potentially hostile territory, separated from supply bases by dozens of kilometers of difficult terrain, exceed the administrative capacity of a 3rd millennium city-state. Nor can Lagash permanently destroy Umma as a political entity. The population will recover over time, the agricultural base will be restored, and the temple institutions that provide political organization will persist even after military defeat. The most that warfare can achieve in this environment is temporary advantage, the establishment of favorable terms that will prevail for a limited period before the underlying dynamics of the state system reassert themselves. This is warfare as a recurring feature of international relations, rather than as a decisive tool for permanently resolving disputes, a pattern that will persist throughout ancient Near Eastern history and indeed throughout human history more generally. From the perspective of military evolution, the Lagash and Umma War represents a significant data point in the development of organized warfare. The phalanx tactics depicted on the Stele of the Vultures show sophisticated understanding of the principles of mass and cohesion, the recognition that disciplined formations can defeat larger numbers of less organized troops, that coordination among soldiers matters more than individual prowess. This tactical insight that warfare is a collective rather than individual activity, that victory emerges from organization and discipline rather than from the heroism of individual champions, represents a crucial step in military development. The same principle will be rediscovered and refined by Greek hoplites 2 millennia later, by Roman legions a millennium after that, and by modern infantry formations that continue to employ variations of the same fundamental concept. The logistical sophistication required to conduct Eannatum's campaign demonstrates administrative capacity that matches the tactical competence shown on the battlefield. The ability to accumulate grain stores sufficient for a campaign of several weeks, to mobilize thousands of men without catastrophic disruption to agricultural production, to coordinate the movement of forces and supplies across dozens of kilometers, to maintain discipline and cohesion throughout the operation. These are achievements of organization and planning that require sophisticated state institutions. The scribal apparatus that tracks inventory, the officials who enforce mobilization orders, the priests who provide ideological justification for warfare, the officers who translate strategic direction into tactical execution, all of these institutional elements must function effectively for campaign success. The development of this administrative capacity is as important to military evolution as any technological innovation or tactical breakthrough. The ideological framework within which Sumerian warfare is conducted also has lasting significance. The combination of religious justification and practical strategic objectives, the framing of territorial conflict as cosmic struggle between order and chaos, the attribution of victory to divine favor rather than purely human agency, these ideological elements serve to mobilize popular support for costly military campaigns, to provide moral certainty to soldiers who must kill and risk death, and to legitimize the political authority of successful military commanders. This pattern of religious sanction for warfare will persist throughout ancient Near Eastern history, will be adopted by later empires and civilizations, and will remain a feature of military ideology into the modern period. The recognition that warfare requires not only material resources and tactical competence, but also ideological support represents sophisticated understanding of the psychological and social dimensions of organized violence. The commemoration of warfare through monuments like the Stele of the Vultures establishes a tradition of military history that continues to the present day. The decision to record tactical details, to preserve casualty figures, to document the outcomes of battles, this is the beginning of military historical writing. The recognition that the experiences of warfare are worthy of systematic study and permanent record. The Stele serves not only as propaganda advertising Lagash's military prowess, but also as a document that allows future generations to understand how their ancestors fought, what objectives they pursued, and what they achieved. The tradition of military commemoration will be continued by later Mesopotamian empires, the Assyrian palace reliefs that depict siege warfare in exhaustive detail, the Babylonian chronicles that record military campaigns with bureaucratic precision, and will eventually develop into the rich tradition of military historical writing that characterizes classical and modern civilization. The technological stasis evident in Sumerian warfare is also worth noting. The weapons and tactics employed in the Lagash and Umma war differ little from those used centuries earlier or centuries later. The bronze spear, the overlapping shield wall, the phalanx formation remained standard for generations. This reflects the limited pace of technological change in pre-industrial societies, where innovation occurs slowly and where traditional methods persist because they are adequate to their tasks. The absence of rapid technological evolution means that tactical competence and organizational capacity matter more than equipment advantages. That victory goes to the side that employs existing technology more effectively rather than to the side that introduces new technology. This pattern will shift dramatically with the introduction of iron weapons, cavalry, and siege technology in subsequent millennia. But in the early dynastic period, warfare is conducted with stable technology that changes little over the lifespans of multiple generations. The broader geopolitical consequences of the Lagash and Umma war extend beyond the bilateral relationship between the two combatants. The demonstration of Lagash's military capacity affects the regional balance of power, influencing the strategic calculations of other Sumerian city-states. Potential allies seek association with the dominant power, while potential adversaries form counter-coalitions to balance against Lagash's supremacy. The patterns of alliance and conflict that emerge in response to Lagash's victory shape the political landscape of southern Mesopotamia for the following generations. This is the operation of balance of power politics in miniature. The same dynamics that will govern international relations in later periods when the scale of political organization has expanded from city-states to territorial empires. The archaeological and textual evidence from the decades following Eannatum's victory shows Lagash at the peak of its power and prosperity. The city expands physically, new temple complexes are constructed, and the material culture reflects wealth and confidence. The inscriptions record ambitious irrigation projects that extend agricultural production into previously marginal lands, trading expeditions that bring exotic materials from distant regions, and diplomatic relations with city-states across Mesopotamia and beyond. This flourishing is directly attributable to the military success at the Gu'edena. The territorial gains increase agricultural surplus. The defeat of the primary rival creates security that allows resources to be invested in development rather than defense and the reputation for military effectiveness facilitates diplomatic and commercial relations. The connection between military power and economic prosperity is direct and unambiguous in this period. Successful warfare funds the civilization that conducts it. The long-term trajectory of both Lagash and Umma illustrates the ultimate futility of limited warfare in a system without hegemonic authority. Despite Eannatum's victory, despite the territorial gains and the favorable settlement, the fundamental dispute between the two city-states remains unresolved. Subsequent generations fight over the same contested territory, erect their own commemorative monuments claiming victory, and impose their own temporary settlements that prove equally ephemeral. The pattern continues until both city-states are subsumed into larger political structures, first the Akkadian Empire of Sargon, which unifies most of Mesopotamia under centralized rule, and later the Ur III dynasty, which creates an even more comprehensive imperial administration. Only when the city-state system itself is transcended, when a larger political entity establishes hegemonic authority over the region, does the cycle of conflict between Lagash and Umma finally cease. This suggests that the limited wars characteristic of the early dynastic period are symptoms of a decentralized international system that contains no mechanism for permanent conflict resolution, the Lagash and Umma. War thus occupies a significant place in the history of warfare, not because it introduces revolutionary innovations or because it determines the fate of empires, but because it represents the earliest well-documented example of organized, state-directed warfare conducted according to rational strategic principles. The sophistication of the tactical system, the administrative capacity required for mobilization and logistics, the ideological framework that legitimizes violence, the tradition of commemoration and historical record, all of these elements that will characterize warfare throughout subsequent history appear in recognizable form in this third millennium conflict over a few square kilometers of agricultural land. The war demonstrates that warfare as a distinct field of human activity subject to analysis and systematic study, emerges early in the development of urban civilization. That the fundamental principles of military affairs are discovered and refined through generations of practical experience, and that the connection between warfare and political organization is intimate and enduring. The cold calculation of costs and benefits yields an ambiguous assessment. Lagash achieves its immediate territorial objectives at acceptable cost. The casualties sustained are significant but not catastrophic. The resources expended are substantial but not ruinous. And the gains in territory and regional dominance justify the investment. For Umma, the defeat represents catastrophe-significant territorial loss, heavy casualties and subordination to a rival power. For the region as a whole, the war perpetuates the cycle of conflict that characterizes the early dynastic period, consuming resources that might otherwise fund peaceful development and imposing human costs that serve no purpose beyond the redistribution of power among competing city-states. The absence of any clear alternative to warfare in this period. No effective diplomatic mechanisms for resolving territorial disputes. No suprastate authority capable of enforcing settlements. No shared ideology that might transcend parochial city-state. Interest suggests that warfare is not an aberration but an integral feature of the political system, an inevitable consequence of the combination of territorial sovereignty and resource scarcity. The lasting impact of the Lagash Umma War on the art of war is primarily documentary rather than innovative. The conflict does not introduce new tactics or technologies that transform military practice. Rather, it preserves in unusual detail the tactical systems that had evolved over previous generations of Mesopotamian warfare. The Stele of the Vultures provides a snapshot of early dynastic military practice that allows modern scholars to reconstruct with reasonable confidence how these ancient armies were organized, equipped, and employed. Without this monument and the textual evidence that accompanies it, our understanding of third millennium warfare would remain speculative, dependent on indirect inference from weapons finds and later sources. The Stele's survival through 4.5 millennia of subsequent history is itself remarkable, a testament to the durability of stone as a medium for historical record and to the importance that subsequent civilizations attached to the preservation of ancient monuments even when the specific events they commemorated had been forgotten. The Lagash Umma War stands as the first border conflict, the earliest well-documented instance of sustained warfare over territorial sovereignty between organized states. It establishes patterns that will recur throughout military history: the employment of violence to resolve disputes over scarce resources, the mobilization of society's resources for organized conflict, the development of tactical systems optimized for specific forms of combat, the commemoration of military achievement through monuments and historical records. 4,500 years after Eannatum led his phalanx against the forces of Umma, the fundamental dynamics of warfare remain. Recognizable states compete for resources and security, mobilize organized violence in pursuit of political objectives, develop military institutions and doctrines to conduct that violence effectively and record their achievements for posterity. The specifics of technology and tactics evolved dramatically across the millennia, but the essential character of warfare as an instrument of state, policy as a test of organizational capacity and collective, will remain constant from the fields of the Gu'edena to the present day. 4.5 millennia separate us from the fields of the Gu'edena. The soldiers who stood in Eannatum's phalanx, who felt bronze scrape against bronze, who pushed until their adversaries broke their names, are lost, their voices silent. But the mechanism of their warfare, the cold architecture of organized violence in service of the state, survives in stone and in principle. This is what we examine at War Atelier. Not the mythology of warfare, not the sanitized heroism, but the craft, the logistics, the friction, the human cost measured against strategic gain. Every conflict, from the first border wars of Sumer to the industrial cataclysms of the modern era, is a problem of resources, will, and execution. A canvas where commanders paint in blood and mud, where the masterpiece is survival, and the critique is written by historians with the luxury of distance. If this analysis of the first documented border war has refined your understanding of military history, If you appreciate the fusion of tactical depth and narrative precision that defines this channel, then your subscription is more than support, it is a signal. A declaration that you demand more from military history than spectacle, that you seek the anatomy of conflict, not merely its theater. Subscribe to War Atelier. Join a community that approaches warfare as an art form worthy of serious study, where every video is a surgical examination of command decisions, tactical evolution, and the machinery of state violence. Turn on notifications. The next operation is already in development, and the wars that shaped our world will not examine themselves. War Atelier, the craft of conflict, the anatomy of power.